Welcome to the M1 podcast, set up to provide features and stories up and down and in and around the M1. Relax and listen. If you enjoy, please share and like. Up to the 1980s, there was a thing called Pirate Radio. What was Pirate Radio? This was before your LMFMs, 98 FM, FM 104 and so on, the licensed radio stations we know of today. Pirate radio became a phenomenon in the 1960s because outside the BBC and in the UK and RTE in Ireland, there was no other licensed radio. So if people want to listen to music, they had to wait for 3 hours a week on the BBC or however long RTE would give it. The most famous pirate radio station known was Radio Caroline, which broadcast from the UK but had its launch here in Ireland, which we'll learn shortly. We'll also learn of the phenomenon of pirate radio in the UK and Ireland, with particular regard to the stations that emerged and continued right up and down what we now know as the M1. I spoke to Brian Greene, a radio and broadcast enthusiast and host of the domains radio.ie and Pirate.ie. First, let's hear some sounds from the pirates of the 1980s.
Bubbling Boychart Radio, in touch with you. Radio Carousel in Southern Ireland.
Broadcasting from Dublin on 738 kHz AM and 102.7 FM in stereo.
Radio Nova, Chris Berry, Radio Nova.
You're tuning into Damien on The Breakfast Show. We're broadcasting on 189 metres medium wave, 1584 on the AM band and 96 FM. We're broadcasting live from the Rockefeller Hotel here in Skerry.
Sunshine Radio.
So Brian, Greenore, County Louth. I remember hearing that in terms of the Dubliner song, Farewell to Carlingford.
I see what you did there, Brian Greenore. Anyway, go ahead.
Anyway, and then Greenore gets if you go to it nowadays, you will see that an abandoned railway town, and it's a very particular type of place. And it's also a port, an industrial port. It's also where we got our kitten about 3 years ago. So Greenore is all that, but it's more. It's the launching pad for what was called Pirate Radio.
Yes, indeed. So, little town of Greenore in County Louth, quite coastal, quite cold on a blustery day. I was there quite recently, and it was the 60th anniversary of the launching of Radio Caroline from Greenore in 1964. So about a week ahead of its broadcasting live on Easter Sunday 1964, it headed from Greenore. So just 1 week earlier it headed away from Greenore, and behind it another ship that was being fitted out in the very same port followed and attempted to compete with Radio Caroline, and eventually that competition ended after a couple of months by them merging together. And yes, so that was the birthplace of
Pirate
Caroline,
Radio.
yeah.
Because Radio Caroline was the best known pirate radio station. It was launched then 1964, is it?
In 64, so it wouldn't be technically the first pirate radio, but in popular terms it very much was for the British Isles and for some of Europe. But Europe had pirates before that. America had pirates before that. And if you want to go way back, one of the first clandestine illegal broadcasts would have been the rebels in 1916 transmitting out a call to the world to say Ireland was declaring itself independent state. And they did that from O'Connell Street from a wireless telegraphy school.
Okay. And so pirate radio was very much a thing in the 1960s, 70s, 1980s, and then regulations changed. But why did they find it? Why did they have to go for pirate radio and not just like normal radio or the way we know it today? What was it like then?
So before you had your Radio Caroline in 64, you did have the swinging 60s. The Stones and the Beatles were on their way. Rock and roll had been about for about 6 years, 7 years. and broadcasting hadn't changed with that youth culture that came along, and you would get maybe an hour or 2 or 3 of music from the BBC, pop music, on the radio a week, 3 hours a week, not a day, 3 hours a week. But you always had Radio Luxembourg, which had been going since the 1920s, coming across the sea with very large power. And from the 40s and the 50s, the big stars that sang records would sing on Radio Luxembourg, and people would use that. Now, that would come in well at night. But what Caroline did was it went into the sea, and it broadcast illegally from the sea from 1964. Easter Sunday is the day that it launched, and it was launched by an Irishman who had connections to that Greenore port, Ronan O Rahilly.
So he was the son of the O'Rahilly, was he? Or
He was a descendant of the O'Rahilly, and not necessarily a son.
And just for people who don't know who that was, who was he?
So the O'Rahilly was a rebel in the 1916 Rising, the very rising I was talking about a moment ago, and he would have finally met his peril on Moore Street, just off the corner of Moore Street, where you'll find a street called O'Rahilly Parade. And the O'Rahilly was a well-known rebel in the 1916 Rising.
So his relatives, a son?
I think it was a grandson, but I'd have to check the history books on that.
And there is a book, and we'll come to talk about that a little bit later. So, would you say that So BBC was where people they would get their audio, and transistor radios were becoming a thing in the 1960s. So young people were able to buy them, and they would maybe have them in their room, or they go walking around with them on the street to listen to whatever was going on. But the only station they could get was maybe Luxembourg and BBC and maybe 1 or 2 others. Is that it?
Luxembourg by night, maybe you get a bit of... If you know your Van Morrison music, he will speak of listening to the Stars of Jazz on AFN. So the Armed Forces Network would have transmitters around Europe and even some in the United Kingdom. And Van Morrison was listening to that and getting inspired to make the music he made from
and so there was a whole lot of bandwidth on the frequency, 88 up to 106. Is that what the FM?
Well, so FM wouldn't have popularised from, around those times. It would be a little bit later, kind of 75, 78 into the 80s as FM. So it was mainly medium wave. So you'd be talking from 530 up to 1600 kilohertz.
So there was a gap there for pirate radio stations, and they weren't able to get licenses. Is that and that's why they went pirate, is it?
Yeah, because there was no means to go legal or have independent local radio or independent national pop radio. So,
and why did Radio Caroline? Why did they feel it was necessary that they would have to? They were based in the North Sea, was it? They started in Greenore, but they had to sail around.
So they sailed around to the Thames estuary, and then they merged. And one of the ships of the 2 ships that left Greenore came up to the Isle of Man and broadcast to Liverpool, Manchester and Dublin and Belfast from there. So the Caroline South and Caroline North. But you asked me, why did they start it at all?
No, why were they in the sea and not just in locations? And
because you weren't allowed to be there. So if you went outside a couple of miles, 3 miles, you'd be in international waters, and there the law of international maritime law would exist, and they had no hold over them. So they kind of copied the idea from some Swedish pirates and some American pirates that were in ships out in international waters broadcasting into large populous cities. But why did they do it? It was a financial thing. So Ronan O Rahilly was a band manager, and he was managing Georgie Fame at the time, and the story goes that he couldn't get the band signed, and there was some issue about it being a mixed race band, and he made the record himself, and he tried to get it on the radio stations that existed, all the ones we've previously mentioned, and they wouldn't play it because he wasn't a major record label. There was a cartel of 4 record labels, and you have your big Decca and Pi and EMI and all these guys, and they bought up the hours on Luxembourg, so you just couldn't get in. So he said, okay, I can't get on the radio, I'll set up a radio station. So he went to America, he got some funding, he knew how to do it, and he got the ships fitted in Greenore, and from there it started.
And it became a big thing in the 1960s.
Yeah, so the way of communicating with a radio station back then was by post. So fans and listeners would write in, and they had a very significant mail delivery when they were about 4 to 6 weeks on air. And estimates, and they could only be estimates because there was no detailed market surveys at the time, estimates would have said 22 million people listening in after 6 weeks on the air in 1964, causing a lot of people to copy that. So you got a lot of copycat stations then coming on in Radio London and Britain Radio and Radio Scotland, and all these ships started to copy this idea.
And in our all ships, was it?
They're all ships, yeah. And some of them were forts in the sea, like Screaming Lord Such of the Monster Raving Loony Party.
Okay.
He had a Radio City on a fort. So it was a magazine fort where they had kind of guns for the World War II, and they were outside territorial waters.
And being on the water, they were mobile. They could get away from the authorities if they needed to.
The platforms and the forts were fixed,
Yeah.
but they were outside territorial waters. They were in international waters, but the ships could move around, and then the ships would then be tendered from places in the United Kingdom, and they'd get their food and their diesel and whatever they needed to keep running.
And pirate radio became a thing in the UK, but it was also a thing in Ireland. I even remember some of the stations, Sunshine Radio, Radio Dublin in the 1980s. But there was other stations up and down the M1.
There was indeed. So in the 60s you would have the start of Radio Dublin. I think it started originally as Radio Ballyauclia, and then into the 70s some of my good friends that I met in the 1980s had AM radio stations that got pushed off the airwaves through court injunctions and raids. So they were land-based, so the police and the post and telegraphs could raid them, and they would go on shortwave next, and then when FM came along, FM was utilised. But along the M1 corridor, all the way from Dundalk down to Lough Shinny, there was some great radio stations. I'll start in Lough Shinny with one of my favourite stations as a young teenager was Community Radio Fingal. Mm-hmm. And it was, I don't know why it was one of my favourites, but it was very accessible and it was very community orientated, and it was only up the road. So if you can think of the signals coming across from Lough Shinny, Donabate, Malahide Estuary, the Baldoyle Estuary, and then to me in Bayside, the coastal signal of AM, it loves seawater, it travels well over seawater. So listening to CRF, Community Radio Fingal from Lough Shinny was a favourite of mine.
What kind of content did they have?
Phone-ins, and not phone-ins like where you talk and give opinions, but like request records and guess the track and things like that. So it was like primitive but homely, and it wasn't super pirate. But then up in Dundalk, this all flourished from about 78 to 88, so 11 years of piracy was on its high in Ireland. 78, you'd start to get the emergence of Radio Carousel, Boyneside Radio, Telstar, Royal County Radio in Meath, and you had
Telstar, Boyneside was Drogheda.
Boyneside was Drogheda, but of course they'd get all their equipment up and running in Drogheda, but then they'd have eyes on Dundalk and Navan and the border. So if you could get to the border, you could then get some high site near the border on the south side of the border and border blast into the north and get your signals in as far as Belfast.
So that's 4 radio stations, and they outside RTE, they were what people would pick up on their radios, those stations.
Yeah, so
and do they broadcast all day long, or?
Yeah, I run a website called Pirate.ie, and it has recordings of all of these that are mentioned. And there's one particular recording where Cardinal Tommaso Fee is at a community fair, and he's been interviewed live by the local radio station, and he's very up to date on the importance and the need for radio, and he's put the question as a lot of pirates would have put to any interviewee back in the day, well, what about the case for local radio, and he was very skillfully able to answer that, And yeah, there was
supported without urging breaking of the law, is it?
Yeah, he certainly sided with the people asking the question and the large listener base. And of course then you had the counterweight of RTE in Ireland. So you had the state radio and you had the bold boys who were breaking the law and putting on, and you did ask, was it all day radio? Yeah, all day radio, and the bigger the stations, they'd go all night as well.
And say Carousel, where was that broadcast? That was Dundalk, was it?
So Carousel was Dundalk, but they would have had relays in, and they even had kind of opt-out kind of studios in Navan and possibly in shopping centres in other towns like Dundalk and Drogheda. So they, similarly, Boyneside from Drogheda, from Donaghy's Mills, they would have broadcast in Drogheda, but they would then have had sites on North County Dublin and Kells and Navan
to
and
extend their
Dundalk.
frequency, is it?
Yeah, so they'd go out from their base and then they'd relay. So they could be heard quite well in Kells and in to Meath. And
it was a mixture of music and current affairs, or just chat, or...
All of the pirates kind of had a very high regard for news. So top of the hour news was very common. You had to provide that. So they'd have newsrooms. I can remember broadcasting illegally from Baldoyle in 86, and our newsroom were quoting the news as heard on Boyneside Radio. So they might be talking about something that happened in Newry or Armagh, and there might have been some fracas, and we're talking about in the times of the Troubles. And then a little Dublin pirate was referencing the source as being Boyneside Radio reports. So yeah, no, they had news. They had a lot of music because it was cheap and easy to have. Think of, a disco DJ rolling in with his box of records, and they just had to have a dozen or 16 them, and they'd cover the week with music. But then they were very interested in local issues as well. So they had news and current affairs and special interest programs. So they were radio in the 70s and 80s wasn't formatted, so you could have a DJ on, and then Mrs. O'Mara from down the road would ask for Dana to be played, and Dana would come on after the specials or Madness or something. There was no format at all. No.
And were some radio stations more successful than others in terms of both listenership and commercial revenue that they're bringing in?
Yeah, so the big kind of change there was that you got your indigenous Irish pirates who are much loved and respected, and our archive is more interested in the smaller stations because less is known about them. But then you had these big super pirates, and they came in the form of two DJs from Radio Caroline in the 60s, Robbie Dale and Spangles Muldoon. Robbie Robinson set up Sunshine in Portmarnock with Chris Carey, aka Spangles Muldoon, and Carey scarpered after a couple of months because the antenna was blown up with dynamite by a rival Dublin radio station.
Wow.
So Carey left, and Robbie Robinson stayed, and it became a bit of a success. And then Chris Carey returned about a year later and set up Radio Nova. And then you had Nova and Sunshine from these two ex-Caroline DJs, and you had... And
they were both very successful stations.
Hugely successful. And I'll go into that in a second. And then in 1985, they were followed by an indigenous super pirate in Q102. So when I say they were successful, they formed the radio that we now have today in the UK and Ireland. So across the UK, local radio, independent radio would have looked to Nova and Sunshine for the way they'd done things. And then Nova was gone by the time licensing came in Ireland, but Sunshine went for a license and didn't get one. But the people that had worked through those stations were the people who work on radio to this day.
Well, this is it. I was talking to Jerry McDermott last week. He's the head of communications in Fingal Council and from Dundalk.
I know Jerry.
Yeah. And he had a I don't know if he had a paid career, but he was working at some of those pirate radio stations on the carousel, I think it was.
They would have paid back then, yeah.
And so he was working with them. So he's now head of communications with Fingal, having worked in the newspapers and LMFM. Then when that got established as a licensed commercial radio station, but then you were saying a lot of the big names in pirate radio became big names in mainstream radio as we know it today. So who would they be?
So if you turn on RTE Gold, and for many decades RTE1 had Ronan Collins, but he's on RTE Gold now. He was on ARD back in the 70s.
ARD?
ARD from the Crofton Airport Hotel, Alternative Radio Dublin, and they had very popular sound and good DJs. Ian Dempsey was with them. He's still with Today FM doing breakfast still. Brendan O'Carroll would have been on ARD as Uncle Bren, the kiddies friend. He did the kind of kiddies show on a Saturday morning.
Oh, wow.
And we've Dave Fanning on Big D Radio, and Dave Fanning still broadcasting to this day. And we're talking
Big D, was that a station, was it? Big
D was a big station in Dublin. So a lot of the stations are formed from breaking away from other stations, splits. Radio Dublin had
politics.
Like politics, exactly. Although the splits are for musical differences, or more commonly people falling out over money and business. But Radio Dublin was the originator in the Dublin space, and they had a big breakaway, and Big D set up, and they really went upmarket and commercial in their approach and took listeners with them. And then ARD was a split of Radio Dublin and took it to the Crofton Airport Hotel. And
Crofton Airport, where's that?
So you would know it as the Regency, or is it now Bonington's?
Oh, Bonington's Hotel, yeah, okay.
So that's where they were set up, and that was a good local Northside station to us. And there was plenty of them, and they provided the people who got the big jobs in radio for the next 45 years.
When you say 45 years,
yeah.
Because pirate radio ended in 1990, was it, or 1991? Was that
so
the time?
December 31st, 88, all the pirates had to close down, and then in the middle of 89, the independent local stations started to pop up. So you had this 6 months where there was RTE and Millennium Radio on the air, and nothing else was supposed to be there. A couple of pirates of very small power on at the time, but what followed next was that you had your Capital Radio, which is FM 104 now, and 98 FM, and they were your two local Dublin stations. You had your Century Radio, which lasted about 18 months and crashed and burned as a business project, replaced by Radio Ireland, which is now Today FM.
Okay. So pirate radio essentially provided a lot of the well-known personalities that we see today. And those people are kind of getting, as you said, 45
retiring.
years. Yeah, they're now retiring. So for the last 30 years, there's been a career in commercial radio, has there, for many people?
Yeah, so 34 years, 35 for many, and they were being paid for a decade before that. So 45 years. Yeah. They blossomed. Like we had such an anarchic radio set up in Ireland. A lot of people came here, a lot of the UK offshore DJs from Caroline, Luxembourg, Voice of Peace off the coast of Israel in the Mediterranean would have come to Ireland and gone to small towns around Cork and Waterford and Galway and Limerick.
Why is that?
Because every town had one of these pirates. So I've mentioned maybe 4 or 6 from Lochshiny to Dundalk. Every town had one. There were 3 in Baldoyle, where we're sitting now. In 1986, there was 2 shortwaves and an FM.
And people could just connect in with them. And in one of the previous episodes, we were talking about in Gormiston College, and the students there were talking about how they used to, on some of the breaks, they'd ring in from the payphones, request to some of the pirate radio stations over the payphone. So it was a different way of interacting with audio back then as compared to now.
We had a payphone in Baldoyle in 86 for my first pirate that I set up. I started a year before that in 85 up in Coolock, but in 86 we had a pirate, and the phone box was our inline. And last August, the Dublin Enquirer...
That was your reception?
That was our reception. The Dublin Inquirer last August did an article on the phone box because it was finally removed last summer and it's gone. So it lasted until last summer, and that was our local. So we were planted in the local community hall. We ran for the summer holidays of our school holidays, and yeah, we used the phone line because, you know, you can't kind of order a phone line when you're 15, 16 years of age, and you had to wait about 6 months to get a phone line in 1986.
You had to lobby your TD to get a phone installed in your house. So that was radio then, and today it's a bit of a different story.
It's still there. Radio is still hugely listened to, and I do accept that it's hugely listened to. But unfortunately, there's a lot of competition. So if you hold a transistor radio from any period in the early 60s to the now, or at least until maybe the not now, but the late 80s, a radio was your great anti-boredom device. It was something that brought you free, endless entertainment, and if you didn't like one channel, you could tune to another. So if you didn't like Dave Fanning, you could get John Peel. If you didn't like John Peel, you could get Tony Prince on Radio Luxembourg. You could jump around whatever you wanted.
I talk about that change because then you had to tune in on your transistor, which was a revelation, I suppose, in the 1960s. But now it's shouting at Alexa, play 2 AM, play RTE Radio. Or as my wife sometimes says, play dinner music.
Well, yes, you can ask a personal assistant to play you a traditional radio station, and you could wonder, has anything really changed other than your hand isn't on a dial or a knob? But it's greater change than that, because what's now become the great anti-boredom device is your mobile phone. So from 1997 onwards, and smartphones with touchscreens have become the de facto anti-boredom device. Look at people when they're on the bus. Earphones are not, earbuds are not. They are head-in phone, killing time. Looking at doctor's surgery, what are people doing to kill time? Are they in a book? Are they in a Kindle? Are they on a laptop? No, they're in a phone. They're not listening to a Walkman. They're not rewinding side B of their tape to hear another song again. That was the 80s and 90s.
And if you saw someone reading a newspaper, you knew that if they're reading the Irish Times, it might be some kind of person. If they're reading the Evening Herald, it might be another kind of person. You can make all kinds of judgments about people.
Back then, but if you saw someone reading the Irish Times now, out and about, sitting on a bench,
phone,
you would probably, if you saw them reading the print Irish Times on a bench in a park, you'd probably think they're a spy or something. Why would they do that?
So that's all the radio stuff, Brian. Tell us about the story of podcasting, your role in it, and I'm only after getting into it recently.
Yeah, I got involved in podcasting around 2004 into 2005. So just to kind of link it to the radio stuff, I was very involved in Pirate Radio post 88, 89, all the way up to about 2003, and there was a big shutdown of Pirates in 2003.
Can I just stop you there for a moment? 2005, that's nearly 20 years ago. And you're talking about podcasting. I think the first time I heard the word podcast was maybe about 5 years ago. So
Oxford Dictionary made podcasting the word of the year in 2005. It was on a huge trajectory upward then. And it started in the United States. Dave Weiner and Adam Curry got together, wrote some code so that you could synchronize a download of an MP3 file from a website to a piece of software on a computer that could synchronize to an iPhone. Well, actually, it wasn't an iPhone at the time, it was an iPod. So the iPhone didn't come till 97. So this was syncing to iPods.
2007. The iPhone?
2007. Let me do that again.
No, that's okay. Let's get these timelines right, because I'm just shocked that podcasting's been around for nearly 20 years, and many people think it's if they're listening to podcasts now, they're early adapters, but it's been around so long.
You see me asking you, will we do that again? Because I know in live radio you can't edit, but in podcasting, of course, you can. But yes, it's 20 years old in a popular sense. Like the first formations of it would have been around 2000 and 2002, but 2004 really starts to take off. And I was replacing something that was called netcasting, which I had been doing at the time. So that was recording radio shows and uploading them to the internet for download. But the software, there was real audio from Progressive Networks, and it sounded like underwater kind of sound. The compression was really bad. But then the whole world of MP3s and Napster and Kazaa and all this BitTorrent stuff started to happen. MP3s were popular, MP3 players were popular, Apple were riding the coattails of that with the iPod, and podcasting was born. The big money people in media expect podcasting to grow really, really fast and really, really big all of a sudden, but it never does. It refuses to. It grows very steadily over the years. But there was another big blip in 2013 when the Serial podcast came along. So this was the first podcast to do over 100 million downloads, and its episodes have now done 375 million downloads of each episode.
What's that?
So the Serial podcast came from a podcast factory, a very popular one, This American Life, the radio station behind that podcast, and they're really good storytellers. Serial was a podcast that was in the true crime area, and it was about an actual murder and somebody who was sentenced, and maybe they weren't guilty of that crime, and an investigation through podcast was done, and this exploded in 2013.
So, and now 2024, the barrier to entry is quite lower than it has ever been. But I suppose going back to the story about pirate radio, that was kind of like the podcasting of its day. It was people creating content because the need wasn't met at that time. Young people wanted to listen to music, and BBC or RTE weren't playing music, so people set up their own radio stations.
Yeah, you've really hit on something there. The need not been met, or technology allowing it to happen. So people are doing it ahead of need because technology allows. And there's pioneers, people who, tinker with soldering irons or tinker with code and know how to put these things together way ahead of commercial industry. So before there's Joe Rogan and Spotify and big deals on YouTube to do podcasting, there's the first wave of independent, homemade inventors who made the whole thing happen. It all started by putting an enclosure tag into RSS files so we could have attached MP3s to come with our blogs.
This might sound all very dizzy type of maths or facts, but it's really the way media has gone in terms of, and I suppose, a fragmentation of media, isn't it?
Yeah, so you're dead right, because you think about it, not in the audio world, go into the video world, that Netflix was posting DVDs at this time, and podcasting came and said, here's this way that you can get media on demand to people's ears. So if you're Blockbuster or Netflix and you're posting DVDs and you're saying, online, if broadband gets better, we could send films down to people's homes. So here you have the opportunity for these businesses to take off, and then they go and kill linear in mass media. So mass media under threat, linear long under threat now, and it's been replaced by video on demand.
So we were talking about the situation for print media in another episode, and now what you're telling me is all media, radio, TV, all linear media is under threat now.
It's under threat by something else that the linear media makers are not alien to. So they've got big archives, they've got media skills, broadcasting and narrowcasting and presentation skills, and they own big incumbent platforms they'd love to lose because they cost a lot of money to provide services over. So they're the ideal people to embrace the new technology. The problem is that when you're in a big, large incumbent media, it's hard to shift. You are a big oil tanker and you can't turn around fast enough. So the startups and the even smaller than the startups, the independents and the inventors can turn around and make things and do things much quicker. Over time, things settle down and they balance out, and then big media can get involved in.
And so the last year, a lot of discussion around RTE, the TV license, and what do you think the future is then for public broadcasting or will the government invest in podcasting, or will they invest in streaming? Is that the way it's going to go?
So public service broadcasting from the big behemoths of RTE and BBC, those organisations are going to be leaner and smaller, but they're going to survive because we absolutely need them. But in a broader sense, there'll be more funding going to cross-platform media. So you'll see that media will centre into, at the community level, into hubs. Think of libraries, and then you can rock into a library and record a video podcast or a music track, or have your choir recorded so it can be sent around the world. That's the future for media at a community level, and there's a public service in that, and there's a public good in providing that. And on the commercial end of things, I'm a little less clear as to how it's going to go, because their business model is really gone. So is big commercial television and big commercial radio going to find new forms of operating without the car advertising and the big money ads that come at Christmas time and keep them alive for the rest of the year?
Very good points. Just going back to the story where we started with the launching of Radio Caroline, the era of pirate radio, it might have evoked some nice memories, or maybe not so nice memories for many people, depending on who they are. Where can people find out more about the story of pirate radio along the M1 and the story of pirate radio in Ireland?
So there's a really good book by Eddie Bowen called A Century of Irish Radio, 1900 to 2000, and Eddie is a good broadcast historian and it covers a lot of the radio stations. Also, I'd recommend my own website that I curate with John Walsh, and that is Pirate.ie, where you got a lot of pictures and audio recordings and articles about the pirates, particularly between 78 to 88.
Brian Greene, thanks very much.
Thank you.
So for some, that content will have evoked some memories, I'm sure. To find out more, please do check out the domain name Pirate.ie. There's some really great stories that Brian has created there. And Eddie Bowen's book on the history of pirate radio in Ireland. Thank you. Stay with us for episodes coming up, where we'll be looking at topics of interest for those of you who are up and down and in and around the M1. I'm Garrett Mullen, and this is the M1 podcast, and thank you to David West for sound and editing.